Hello and welcome back to the Cineskinny. It's the film podcast from the Skinny magazine. No reviews this week because we have something I think even better. Jamie has been talking to Felipe Bustos Sierra, the director of the excellent new documentary Everybody to Kenmure Street. This is the film that opened Glasgow Film Festival. It tells the story of community resistance to a Home Office deportation raid in the Southside of Glasgow back in 2021. Won an award at Sundance, much acclaim on GFF premiere, enormous standing ovation, and it is out across the UK from next Friday. So Jamie sat down with Felipe a couple of weeks ago to talk about the film, about the power of protest and solidarity, and the political history of Glasgow and Glasgow's Southside in particular. Enjoy the chat. Go and see the film. It's very good. We'll be back in 2 weeks. Enjoy.
Before we get on to Kenmure Street, I just wanted to take you back to when you were a kid and just ask what first got you interested in cinema and, when did that kind of passion start?
I mean, always loved film. I think there's two things that sort of happened around the same time. One is my dad was a journalist. At the time, he was exiled from Chile, and he was on the blacklist from Chile, which meant he wasn't able to go back. And so in 1989, so a year after the democracy, I'm doing air quotes around democracy, came back to Chile, the borders opened up again for people who'd been on blacklist. But he was still too worried. So he bought a big VHS camera, and for essentially my mom to go back to Chile and take us, me and my sisters, and go to the house where he lived and see old pals. And so I ended up just getting, I always kind of loved technology, always been fascinated by the camera. And I ended up working out how the camera worked. And so I ended up filming quite a bit of that trip. And so I think there was an understanding of, there was a sense of this is for my dad who's not allowed to come back to his country. And there was a sort of kind of that sensitivity at the back of my head is like, how do I show this? Because clearly so little that we're finding is similar to what he told us about, right? And how much his country has changed in at that point, 15 years already. And then I was always interested in film. I love film as entertainment, but then I saw when I was 12, I saw Stand By Me, which I found so moving. I think it has the thing of like it's entertainment, but I just find it so profound. I think this idea of obviously what happened in Chile, we had a certain relationship with death and how close to us it could be, and obviously Stand By Me kind of taps into a little bit, the kind of like early in life finding about immortality. So I think from that point on, I realized, oh my God, this is what films can do. And I've been sort of interested in finding out what it would be to be a filmmaker, to be a director and understand the different roles. And it started that way.
So, obviously you should also mention R.I.P. Rob Reiner, who passed away horribly. He's been on a lot of people's minds recently. I think, definitely his films were a big influence on a lot of people.
No, for sure. And I suppose I was growing up because he was making all these kind of big hits. I think maybe he wasn't giving his due, but he's worked in so many genres. I mean, I loved Stand By Me got me into Stephen King. So I loved Misery. I loved, not the concept of Misery, the film Misery, but When Harry Met Sally, The Princess Bride, and then I got into Spinal Tap, and I was mockumentary, like a fake documentary. And there was a level of approaching storytelling that I thought he was just so versatile at. So I was really sad by what happened to him.
Yeah, completely. So when did documentary first start to interest you in? So I guess you're making home movies. You're kind of making documentaries. I guess you would call them like To Send Back to Your Dad. Yeah. Is that how you would describe them?
Completely. I mean, in being from Chile, documentary played a big part in kind of capturing the resistance or just capturing what was lost in Chile. So one of the first films that I've watched, knowing I was watching something that was beyond entertainment, I suppose, was The Battle of Chile. It was a Patricio Guzman 3-part. I remember being, sent to bed early because I know they were watching it and it was really serious. And that footage you see at the very beginning of Ne Pasarán, my previous film, of this black and white footage of the hawker hunters flying lows over Santiago and firing rockets into the palace. I saw that through like a sort of half-open door. It made me think of like Hollywood productions of war films, but very much on the understanding that this was real and it was done against people like my dad, I guess, of their political persuasion. Maybe political is the wrong word. So I think from that moment on, I started watching a lot of documentaries, and it is, there's this whole thing about Chilean documentary of literally being the memory of Chile during those years. So it's something that's always been close, always had sort of kind of, a keenness about exploring that.
Well, maybe that'd be a good place to go on to the 13th of May into 2021. You know, what were you doing that day? What's your memories? You know, when did you first realise this was happening on Kenmure Street?
I mean, really, really early on. I lived in Govan Hill at the time, so just a 10-minute walk, and I got a text from somebody who's in the film, you know, was reaching out to try to get people to come, and I think I just kind of shared. Ne Passaran was on TV at the time, or had just been on TV, so it was on iPlayer. So I was getting loads of messages to like the social media of Ne Passaran, like, can you reshare this? This is happening. And so I did all that, but I think I had a sense of not necessarily despair, but sort of hopelessness that nothing's going to come out of this. You know, we tried to kind of place the audience into that headspace at the time of, you know, it was on the back of Black Lives Matter, which has been so big and so global, but really had sort of fizzled out, and no concrete policies that come out of it. You know, there was the murder of Sarah Everard, where you found out it was a police officer, and then the vigils in her name were also violently repressed. So there was a sense that there was no conscience at work when it came to kind of these events. And peaceful protests were very much one-sided. Also, during Ne Passaran, you know, I talked to a few people involved with the Foreign Office or the Home Office. You know, I remember this conversation with this guy working in Whitehall, and he was telling me about, you know, a million people walking outside in London for protesting against the war in Iraq. And I remember asking, what did you feel about this? And we just closed the window for the noise. So there was, in that sense, it's like, well, what is a protest going to achieve? So I think that was very much my headspace. So I reshared it on social media that day, and then, you know, and then kind of kept an eye on it on social media, and realized there's something else happening, and was quite, I suppose, quite blown away by the direction it taken all of a sudden. And I felt like I've never experienced that. You know, I've been involved in solidarity movement and student protests most of my childhood, and you know, we'd had some victories in the Chile Solidarity campaign, but nothing really so immediate and nothing so visceral. And I realized I think it's something that I needed to experience, and I had a chance to. And despite solidarity really equating, maybe not so much for ourselves as a family, but for like other people in Chile, solidarity equal with survival. And I felt I needed to do something about it. I need to respond in a different way. And I need to kind of rethink about the way we look at civil disobedience and protest. And so I immediately kind of went out and started talking to people. And within the week, I realized there's something new here. There's a new intelligence about the way we look at solidarity. And maybe, you know, the Black Lives Matter movement fizzled out in anything kind of governmental, but it's something in people's mind. They've changed their approach to it. And understanding that, you know, if you're standing up in a protest and you might be arrested, your background will give you access to a very different safety net. And there was that understanding on the day. And I thought that was wonderful. And I thought, so I think, within a few days, I contacted Kira Barry, who's a producer who also lives, and who lived around the corner of Kenmure Street. And so the idea to at least start developing a film, or at least getting funding so we could do this properly and go as far as we wanted to with it, that's where it all came out for that first week.
So it sounds like it really, not only did it inspire you to make the film, it kind of maybe changed give you a bit more belief in the power of protest, the power of solidarity.
No, completely. And I think very much like, you know, I didn't know who were in the van, and I only had a few friends on the street, but I felt like the people who'd given me their solidarity back in the past, I let them down, right? It's what we're trying to experience with the film. It's solidarity is repeated gestures through time, and it doesn't really matter who you're doing it for or who's doing it for you. It matters that it just needs to happen perpetually, and we're going to have to. You know, in Chile, say la lucha es eterna, the struggle is eternal, and you have to be a part of it. And so I think the film, essentially became a response, because I wasn't there, but, you know, Ne Passaran had made a decent impact, and I felt, well, I've got momentum to make another film. And I wanted to use, I suppose, my skills and, you know, and the people I know around me who would connect with this as well, to see what we can do to sort of really document this properly. So it goes beyond the headlines and beyond a few sound bites and beyond a few tweets.
Well, that's interesting you weren't there, because actually it kind of informs the form of the film, because the film becomes other eyewitnesses. You know, you sort of crowdsource all the footage essentially. So like, when did that form come into your mind that you're going to use footage from the day from other people? Does that just come instantly?
I think really early on, I think obviously the social media played a big part on the day and gave us sort of direct access to footage and to moments that we knew would create a sort of spine in terms of like a chronological spine for us to help us with the research, but also for the storytelling of it. It gave us an idea of, oh, that person's filming, that may be interesting to find their footage. They're getting that angle. What's that person doing over there? Who are they talking to? What kind of conversation they're having? So it was also it was lockdown at the time. We kind of, we talk a little bit in the film, but I don't know. I think maybe we move on quite quickly, but understanding how difficult it was to meet with people back then. And so the first 6 months of research were really just every day or every other day, doing 10,000 steps with a person that attended a protest around Queen's Park. And, so in the span of an hour, talking about what they'd witnessed, what they'd seen, maybe what they'd done, but so a bigger sense of, I didn't go, and that was a bit my barometer. Why did you go? What was the hope? Where was the hope? And most people said, we had no hope. But I think it's this thing of, which I think is very important with storytelling. Sometimes it can become transformative. And I was just hearing people telling me so much about their anger or their frustration with this. And I felt like connecting all these little pockets of I suppose, storytellers and witnesses on the street together would kind of give a sense that there was something bigger and something maybe document for people who weren't there. But also, again, really early on, getting really that sense of the mechanics of the protest and very much being this sort of baton relay. And a bit, I think, like when these things happen, I've gone through like quite a few years of Q&As for Ne Passaran, right? And it's about these 4 old retired guys in East Kilbride. 3 of them have passed away now. And they had that sense of, they always felt that, we didn't do much, right? And we know they have now, but they felt like we didn't do much in the sense of, we had this little perimeter of action within what we were capable of doing, and we did that, and that was it. But then, the film, they get put in the film, and all of a sudden they get kind of put on a pedestal and sanctified, and maybe that doesn't really help what we need, which is understanding that it's a bit an overused line, but that they're ordinary people who did the best they could. And it's the same on Kenmure Street. Van Man, as he told me, is maybe useful for about 15 minutes, literally just taking up space and buying time for somebody else to get a better idea and passing the baton like this. So it really felt like the whole day was like this. So part of, which obviously makes telling that story in a 90-minute film quite difficult because you don't have leaders. Again, there's an element of safeguarding. You don't want to place the burden of what happened on the day on the shoulders of 1 or 2 people. So a lot of it was just, we have the time. We may not have the resources, but we have the time. So let's talk to all these people and see what the story is, and then eventually sort of like kind of create a timeline out of all this and create a flow, I think, more than a timeline.
And you say that, it was very much about kind of people come together and it's a community. It's a film about a community, I think, but also real kind of characters emerge. You talked about Van Man, who we never actually see. Where did you get the inspiration to put in a proxy for Van Man and for the nurse who was kind of also under the van with him?
I mean, initially, I feel like filmmaking is all about problem solving. So that was solving a problem. It took a while. It was sort of this kind of circle of trust growing around all these conversations we're having in Queen's Park. I was like, I'd love to talk to that person, and so on. So eventually, I got to both Van Man and the nurse, who for different reasons just wanted to remain their anonymity, keep their anonymity. And I was like, but what you've just told me is amazing. How do I put that in the film? So at first, it was really kind of sort of a safeguarding process. We'll get an actor. We'll just use your words, but we'll get an actor to stand in instead of you. And at that point, I think I was kind of in the soup. There was a lot of ideas flowing. I talked to a lot of people, so I think in my head, we still couldn't really be able to edit things. So it was just, how do I convey, I suppose, their conviction and their confidence? And the nurse in particular is incredibly good at what she does. And I wanted that to come across. And eventually, once you put that, you get an actors in. So there's an artifice. So how do we deal with the artifice? Because we have this absolutely authentic, all these kind of smart footage from the day. We have all people who were actually there describing exactly how they feel. So it felt like, we need to maybe create a little mise en scène here. So obviously at that point, I had a connection through Nepa Saran, I received a really lovely letter from Emma Thompson. There's a conversation that started there. And so when this project came about at that point, I was like, I kind of talked to her. I was like, it'd be great to have you involved because it's a small thing. It's quite, well, I don't think it's controversial, but I think there's a lot of disingenuous disinformation about it. And we need something to kind of keep our head above water and understand that we're telling a legitimate story here. And then when this problem arose, I was like, how do you feel about stepping into Feldman's shoes?
Can you go back to what is the disinformation or the disingenuous aspect?
Oh, I mean, the whole, from pretty much the day after, calling it was a violent mob.
Okay.
And sort of, or, I mean, the basic shit you get about protests these days are like, it's all paid performers. And when I'd been spending 6 months talking to like immediate neighbors and people who lived there, who've lived for like decades, and that was very much their neighborhood. So it really felt like the protest came from the community and a desire to preserve their community and a proper love for their community. So that was important for us too.
So you've got Emma Thompson and Kate Dickie who are playing Van Man and the nurse who was kind of key in kind of keeping him safe. But you've also got other characters who kind of emerge. I was also incredibly impressed by Amar Anwar, who's the human rights lawyer who gives just an incredibly rousing speech to the crowd and really kind of lifts everyone, I think. That was a kind of great moment.
Yeah, it's funny. It's something, his name pops up quite a bit throughout the day in footage. Somebody say, at 10 in the morning, oh, somebody should get Amar Anwar in here. and he does show up. And I think what he brings is, he brings the language of the law with him. And, as well bolstered by the 2,000 people who have showed up at that point and have made it very clear to everybody on the street that they're not going anywhere. And, when they turn the bus stops into a food point, open their clothes for people to use the bathroom, they're creating all these sort of anti-cattling measures and kept sort of a certain, bonhomie and sense of humor about the whole thing that was, I think, quite disarming, to people who thought that this might turn into something quite violent. So you see in the film, I think he gets there and he's asked by various different people to come to the streets, including the police. But when he gets there, I think he understands what this is and what this has become, and I think he gets very much emotionally taken over by it.
And I like how the film it's about the day of the 13th, but it's also very much about Glasgow and the history of Glasgow and the history of dissent in Glasgow.
Of course, yeah.
Can you talk about bringing in that aspect, digging into the archive and sort of bringing in those elements?
I mean, that very much comes from these early conversations of Queen's Park and having the time to kind of delve into topics that maybe were not immediately at hand. And I suppose I come from it from, I've seen a lot of solidarity movements in my life. There's a sort of a shorthand about the way you approach this. But I was talking to young people telling me, well, I was there because I was just so furious that nobody has ever done anything about this. And that's great because that anger brought you onto the street, but also people have been doing this in Glasgow specifically and in the Southside in particularly for centuries, right? And why does that history get lost? And then you have people older than me who have been doing this since they were like teenagers, and despite all the setbacks, just keep turning up, and so they all get to kind of experience this victory together, which I think we all needed to feel and see. And part of making the film is trying to get maybe people to come to see the film who didn't show up, like myself, to just feel that for a moment. But then part of this conversation was also, what was your motivation for going? What is the language that you bring to Kenmure Street? And so often they would say, well, my father was involved in this, or my mom was involved in this, or my aunt was one of the people at the Lee Jeans factory in Greenock. And so all this kind of oral history gets passed through families or through friends or just people, who just keep abreast of these things. And so, in the fact that we have Eileen Reid, the daughter of Jimmy Reid, who lived right around the corner, was filming the whole thing. It was her clip that went viral at the end of the day, got 10 million views within a few hours. It just really felt like there was a sort of personal history of Glasgow that somehow had coalesced on the street and had connected through all these different strangers. And so they all had a different way to articulate why I'm here today. And so that was quite a lovely thing to do, to be able to kind of research all of that and connecting all these neighborhoods, obviously Governing Hall with Governing Bath, but all that sort of recent history. It felt like there was, again, a sort of kind of chain reaction that was culminating on Kenmure Street in a way that had never been so successful before.
But also you don't shy away from the paradox of Glasgow. You know, it's this kind of city that's a city of radical politics and a city of diversity, but it's also kind of built on the back of exploitation and slavery. I thought that was interesting to bring that in, and I think someone even suggests in the film that part of that is why we are such a radical city, is the kind of inequality that came through that kind of exploitation of people is kind of made the city that as radical as it is.
Completely. I think it becomes unavoidable if you want to talk about dissent or injustice in Glasgow. There's somebody I interviewed who passed away quite recently, Kathy Galloway, who she was the first female warden of the Iona community and had a long history herself of protests. I talked to a lot of people who've been involved in protests in Glasgow's history while making this. And she talks very much about injustice being often this invisible thing. And she said, as a working class woman in Glasgow, all you have is your body. So you put your body in front of the invisibility to make it visible. And I think that very much stuck with me in the way I suppose Glasgow is built, where it doesn't take long. You don't have to live long in Glasgow to feel a certain pride about the way Glasgow looks, but it's entirely because of the exploitation of people halfway across the world. And Glasgow being the second city of the empire, the Scottish Enlightenment, all that exploitation is baked into those great triumphs. And at school you hear about those triumphs, but you don't hear how they come about. And once you know how those things come about, it's just this constant compromise you have to make with yourself of, I'm living in here, I'm enjoying some of it, but I'm also aware that we are here because of this legacy. And I think myself and I think most people I know have this feeling that something needs to be done about this.
It's also a kind of bittersweet film because, it's very much inspiring because we win this battle. I think it's clearly, people will walk out this film, I think, with a spring in their step and a tear in their eye, probably. But it does also feel a little bit like we're losing the war. I think, as an immigrant yourself, the conditions for immigrants is probably worse now. Even under a Labour government than it was under the Tories 5 years ago. So what is your hope for the film in terms of the UK? Do you see it as being kind of inspiring us and telling us that actually we can fight this kind of oppression?
I mean, pretty much. I think that's all it is. It's been, in so many ways, there was a point where we felt like we couldn't make the film fast enough because we were getting further and further away from the event itself. And I was like, is there still going to be a relevance? And it feels like now it's coming out at a time where it's more relevant than ever, not just in Scotland, but globally. And I mean, the basic truth about all this injustice is that it's man-made. And I think people need to understand this way. I think sometimes the law of the jungle is brought that this is, the stronger will step on the weaker, and that's how things are. And it's not to be, it's how it appears to be because the people who've made incredible fortunes on the back of it for centuries, it's good for them to entertain this myth, but it is man-made, and if it is man-made, it can be unmade. And that felt to me in all the conversation about Kenmure Street on the day, people the sense of we're all strangers, but we believe in somehow the same thing, and we can undo this thing that's just happening in front of our very eyes. And so it feels like it's a lot of work. Obviously, Kenmure Street is incredibly local, right? It's in the grand scheme of things, it's a small crowd, and it's a very it's neighbors and residents, and a few people who were attracted through social media. But what they've applied, what they've experienced on a day, can be applied anywhere. We have this. You won't have heard this because this is not in the final cut, not in the rough cut. But we have this is crucial moment on the day where the police attempted to charge a crowd, and we've recorded this choir song here in Glasgow, one of the oldest Gaelic choir, the Gaelic Music Association. And they're singing the same mantra, both in Gaelic and in Urdu, which is basically saying, it will take all of us. And I think that's quite important because I think it's true. I think that's our way out. It will take all of us to literally create a safe space for all of us to live in. And I think when you look at Kenmure Street, all it achieved really is 2 guys got to go home, but like how basic is that, right? It's just literally create a safe space for your neighbor. So I hope that comes across.
Well, I mean, you just said it's a local story, but you're also going to be premiering. The world premiere is going to be in Sundance, which I'm sure must be incredibly nerve-wracking and exciting. But obviously, I can imagine this film will resonate across the pond as well, because obviously we know what's happening in the Twin Cities right now, what's been happening since Trump sent his kind of thugs out on the street. So do you have any anticipation of how it might go down? What are you expecting of that premiere?
I mean, I think just the fact that we got into Sundance, I think speaks to the resonance of what happened there. I think maybe for them it feels like it's a little microcosm halfway around the world of what's happening to them at the moment. I've done a few interviews with the US press who are, physically quite moved by what's happening on screen. I mean, there's a relief because in some way we've made it so ultra specific to Glasgow, right? But really, those history sequences we talk about Glasgow and its only history of dissent and civil disobedience and injustice feels very much like it's the history of the Western world for the last 400 years. So I'm not particularly surprised that resonates everywhere, particularly in the US, who's been, enacting those policies across the world. It's why I'm here. It's why Chile, who had a democratically elected president, fell. It's what they've done to so many countries around the world. And now they're doing it to their own country. So I had this interview with this guy in Salt Lake City who was he kind of broke down while we were talking about this. And all I could say was like, well, we're all seeing it. We're all feeling it exactly the same way. And again, we're all potentially united, and it will take all of us to overturn this. So, I mean, it's intense at the moment, but I'm hopeful. I think that the film will be not so much well received, but I think we'll find an audience. And, like Ne Passerán, who came out 7 years ago, and we still had like a sold-out screening in Inverness just a couple of weeks ago. I think it doesn't matter. I think we make these films to stand alone and to be timeless. They're stories. This is essentially is a siege film in many ways, and so I think it's very accessible. And I think I just hope it does what it did for me, which is Riggin not showing up and knowing that next time it turns up, we all have to show up.
Well, I know Ne Passerán closed the GFF. I want to say 7 years ago, something like that.
2018,
yeah. And I think that must be one of my best ever Glasgow screenings. It was kind of electric. If any film is going to do well in Glasgow, I think it's going to be this one, which is such a love letter to Glasgow and its community, and especially that community in the Southside. So yeah, I can imagine you're looking forward to that Glasgow screening. That's like a screen that's guaranteed to go well. But can you just say a few words about opening your local film festival?
I mean, I'm so looking forward. I think half the room will be people who were present there, and I love that. Because the day itself was so dense, I think some people experienced the protests, never really leaving their clothes or their side of the streets. And I think the film maybe helpfully shows what was happening all over the streets. They'll discover new things. I love, from the screening today, we had people who were there, or people who just suddenly recognize one of their pals in the crowd. So I think there might be some audience member playing Where's Waldo with some of our footage. But yeah, the closing gala of Ne Passerán at the GFT was like a core memory for me. I'd never seen an audience respond to the screen so emotively. And the moment when the guys in Ne Passerán received their medals and everybody was turned around and everybody was standing up applauding and tears in their eyes, I just didn't think that something I could make could have that reaction. So there's definitely a few moments like this in here, and I think there's this. Somebody at the end, right, says that to experience something like those emotions with your community, it kind of change your brain chemistry. And I mean, that's what going to the cinema has done for me from a really early age. I love going to see a comedy. I love to see horror films with a crowded cinema, because you just get such a rush from the crowds. And so yeah, protest and going to the cinema, there's something emotionally quite similar. And I hope more people will get to feel some of that.